Money makes America move. Billions, even trillions of dollars flowing in and out of Uncle Sam's wallet every single year. But here's the big question. Where does it all come from? And more importantly, where does it all go? In 2023 alone, the US government brought in a jaw-dropping $4.4 trillion. Trillion with a T. But it didn't stop there. It spent over $6.1 trillion. To put that into perspective, $4.4 trillion could do all of this. End world hunger for the next decade. Provide clean water for everyone on Earth for 1 year. Eliminate extreme poverty worldwide for 1 year. Give every American universal health care and free college for a year. Permanently eradicate homelessness in the US. Build enough solar panels and windmills to power America indefinitely. And ensure every child on the planet gets a quality education for 6 years. And you'd still have $216 billion left over for anything unexpected. And yet somehow, America is still in debt. So how do they decide what to spend it on? Why does one program get billions while others barely scrape by? And why, for better or worse, do your hard-earned tax dollars end up funding some pretty unexpected things? This isn't just about spreadsheets and pie charts, it's about priorities. Every dollar is a choice. Do we spend it on education or national defense? Healthcare or highways? Social security or sending another rover to Mars? The way the government raises and spends money reflects what the nation values most and what it's willing to sacrifice. But who makes these decisions? And how much say do you really have in any of it? Stick around, and by the end of this video, you'll not only know where your tax dollars are going, but also why. We'll break it down into the good, the bad, and the downright puzzling. Spoiler alert, there will be some surprises along the way. So grab your coffee, because we're about to pull back the curtain on the biggest money machine in the world. Ready to follow the money? Let's dive in. In the 2023 fiscal year, the US government generated an impressive $4.439 trillion in revenue. But as you can see in this chart, revenue fluctuates significantly year to year, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of GDP. So what's driving these changes? One big factor is the health of the economy. When the economy booms, government revenues often increase because people earn more, businesses make higher profits, and more goods and services are being consumed. But during downturns, like the early 2000s recession, the 2008 financial crisis, or the COVID-19 pandemic, revenues take a hit. Why? Job losses and reduced spending mean less income, fewer corporate profits, and lower tax collections. You might also have noticed that revenue as a percentage of GDP doesn't always move in lockstep with total revenue. That's because tax policy plays a huge role here. For example, tax cuts, even during a booming economy, can lower the government's share of GDP, while tax increases or reforms can raise it, even during slower growth periods. Now, let's talk about where all this revenue comes from. Most of it comes from just a few key sources: income taxes, payroll taxes, and corporate income taxes. But smaller contributions come from excise taxes, customs duties, Federal Reserve earnings, and a mix of other sources. Let's break these down one by one. We'll see not only how much they contribute, but also how each source reflects the priorities and policies of the US government.
Now watch this drive.
Individual income taxes are the backbone of federal revenue, paid by nearly every working American. They are based on how much you earn and are deducted from paychecks or filed during tax season. But income taxes aren't just a federal matter. States often collect their own income taxes, which are separate from what you pay the federal government. While the federal tax applies uniformly nationwide, state taxes vary dramatically. Some states, like Texas and Florida, don't collect income taxes at all, while others, like California, impose higher rates to fund their state-specific programs. Back in 2000, under President Bill Clinton, the federal government collected just over $1 trillion in individual income taxes. This marked a period of economic growth and balanced budgets.
On your mark, get set. We're riding on the internet.
Taxes were high for wealthier Americans, with a top marginal rate of 39.6%. When George W. Bush took office in 2001, he quickly implemented major tax cuts through the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act. These cuts lowered rates for all income brackets, reducing government revenue. By 2003, the government was collecting around $850 billion annually, down from $1 trillion. Combined with increased spending on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, deficits soared. Fast forward to the Great Recession in 2009. Under President Obama, income tax revenue dropped to just $915 billion as millions of Americans lost jobs or took pay cuts. To stabilize the economy, Congress passed temporary tax relief measures, further shrinking revenue. By 2013, however, the American Taxpayer Relief Act reversed some Bush-era tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. Revenue rebounded, climbing to $1.7 trillion by the end of Obama's term. Enter President Trump in 2017. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act overhauled the tax code, slashing rates for corporations and individuals. While this gave many Americans a short-term tax break, federal income tax revenue dipped slightly, hovering around $1.9 trillion by 2020. Under President Biden, income tax revenue surged to $2.226 trillion in 2023. This increase came as the economy rebounded from the pandemic and tax revenues reflected wage growth in a tight labor market. Biden's administration also allowed certain provisions of the Trump tax cuts to sunset, ensuring higher revenue without introducing drastic new tax policies. Through wars, recessions, tax cuts, and recoveries, income tax revenue has mirrored America's highs and lows. It's a story of policy, economics, and the choices America makes as a country. But one thing is clear: individual income taxes remain the engine that keeps the government running. Payroll taxes. Chances are you've seen them deducted from your paycheck, but might not know exactly what they're for. Unlike individual income taxes, which fund a wide range of federal and state programs, payroll taxes are earmarked specifically for Social Security and Medicare. They are designed to ensure that when you retire or need healthcare in old age, those safety nets are there for you. Here's how they work. Employers and employees split the bill. For most workers, 6.2% of wages go to Social Security and 1.45% to Medicare. Employers match that amount. If you're self-employed, you pay both halves. Ouch. And unlike income taxes, payroll taxes are only levied by the federal government. In 2000, payroll taxes brought in about $700 billion, driven by a strong economy and low unemployment. At the time, Social Security and Medicare programs were seen as financially stable. When George W. Bush became president, payroll tax revenue dipped slightly. Why? The economy slowed after the dot-com bubble burst, and unemployment ticked up. But by the mid-2000s, a growing economy and higher wages pushed payroll tax collections to over $850 billion. And that's with no major changes to payroll tax rates during Bush's presidency. Then came the Great Recession. Payroll tax revenue dropped to $800 billion in 2009 as unemployment soared to 10%. To stimulate the economy, Obama introduced a temporary payroll tax cut in 2011 and 2012, reducing the employee portion of Social Security taxes from 6.2% to 4.2%. This left workers with more take-home pay, but lowered payroll tax revenue during those years. By 2013, the tax cut expired, and payroll tax revenue bounced back, reaching $1.1 trillion by the end of Obama's second term. Under President Trump, payroll taxes remained steady, with no significant changes to the rates. Revenue hovered around $1.2 trillion annually. However, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 briefly interrupted the trend. Businesses shut down, millions lost jobs, and payroll tax collections dipped temporarily.
It's a disease, without question, has more names than any disease in history. I can name Kung Flu. I can name 19 different versions of names.
By 2021, as the economy reopened under President Biden, payroll tax revenue surged again. Wage growth, fueled by a tight labor market, boosted collections to $1.477 trillion in 2023, the highest in history. Through multiple recessions, wage stagnation, and a global pandemic, payroll taxes have remained a reliable cornerstone of federal revenue. Corporate income taxes are what businesses pay on their profits. In the United States, these taxes are primarily collected at the federal level, but can also be imposed by state governments. The federal corporate tax rate applies uniformly to all businesses, while state rates vary, ranging from 0% in places like Wyoming to as high as 11.5% in New Jersey. But here's the kicker. Corporate taxes aren't just about rates. They are also influenced by deductions, credits, and loopholes. Companies often use these tools to reduce their taxable income. Let's take a look at how corporate income tax revenue has changed over the years, tracking how policies and economic events shaped the contributions of American businesses. In 2000, under President Bill Clinton, the federal government collected $207 billion in corporate taxes. Businesses thrived during the tech boom, and a strong economy drove up corporate profits and tax revenue along with them. When George W. Bush took office in 2001, things began to shift. The economy entered a recession, and the Bush administration enacted tax cuts designed to stimulate growth. Corporate taxes were reduced, leading to a dip in revenue. By 2003, revenue hit a low of $131 billion.
Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.
However, as the economy recovered, corporate tax revenue climbed, reaching $370 billion in 2007, just before the Great Recession. The 2008 financial crisis sent corporate profits and taxes plummeting. In 2009, revenue dropped to just $138 billion, one of the lowest points in decades. But as the economy rebounded under President Obama, corporate tax revenue grew steadily, peaking at $343 billion in 2015. Obama's administration also pushed for stricter enforcement on tax avoidance by multinational corporations, closing some loopholes. Under President Trump, everything changed with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. The corporate tax rate was slashed from 35% to 21%, one of the largest cuts in history. Revenue dropped from $297 billion in 2017 to $204 billion in 2018. President Joe Biden took a different approach.
Hello.
While the corporate tax rate remained at 21%, his administration focused on enforcing tax compliance and closing loopholes. As a result, corporate tax revenue climbed significantly, reaching $425 billion in 2022, a 20-year high. This increase reflected strong corporate profits in a post-pandemic economy and more effective tax collection efforts. From booms to recessions, tax cuts to crackdowns, corporate tax revenue tells the story of America's economy. Excise taxes are special taxes on specific goods, services, or activities. Unlike income taxes, which apply broadly to earnings, excise taxes are tied to things like gasoline, alcohol, tobacco, and airline tickets. Think of them as use taxes. When you buy these items or engage in these activities, you are paying for the privilege. These taxes are handled by both the federal and state governments. For instance, when you fuel up your car, you are paying a federal excise tax of 18.4 cents per gallon, and likely an additional state excise tax, which varies depending on where you live. In 2000, excise tax revenue was $69 billion under President Clinton, driven by strong economic growth and steady consumption of fuel, tobacco, and alcohol. Revenue fluctuated under President Bush, dipping to $67 billion by 2008 due to alternative fuels and the war on terror. The Great Recession, saw a decline under President Obama, but tobacco tax hikes and rising air travel helped it peak at $95 billion in 2016. Under President Trump, revenue remained around $95 billion despite economic growth. By 2023, however, declining sales of tobacco and alcohol have caused excise tax revenue to shrink to $76 billion. Excise taxes may not grab headlines, but they are deeply woven into our daily lives. Whether you're pumping gas, lighting a cigar, or boarding a plane, you're helping fuel government programs, one tax at a time. Customs duties are taxes the U.S. government imposes on imported goods. These charges are meant to protect domestic industries and control trade balances. For example, when companies import steel, electronics, or textiles, they pay customs duties based on the value of the goods. Unlike income taxes, customs duties are solely managed by the federal government. The funds collected go into the U.S. Treasury, helping to fund federal programs and infrastructure. Customs duty revenue hovered between $20 and $30 billion under President Bush due to low tariffs from free trade agreements like NAFTA. Under President Obama, revenue grew to $35 billion by 2016 as trade recovered and tariffs on imports like Chinese tires were introduced. President Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods and metals during the trade war caused customs revenue to skyrocket to $69 billion by 2020.
Say China. 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 China.
Under President Biden, it peaked at $100 billion in 2023 as post-pandemic trade boomed and many Trump-era tariffs remained in place. While these charges often spark debates about their impact on consumers and businesses, they remain a powerful tool for shaping trade and protecting domestic industries. Their role in the U.S. economy is a reminder of how deeply interconnected policy, trade, and revenue truly are. The Federal Reserve, often called the Fed, is the central bank of the United States. Its job? To stabilize the economy, manage inflation, and ensure a healthy financial system. It does this through tools like setting interest rates, controlling the money supply, and regulating banks. But here's what's fascinating. The Fed also earns money, a lot of it. Federal Reserve earnings mainly come from interest on the massive portfolio of U.S. government securities it holds, along with income from loans to financial institutions and fees for services like check processing. These earnings are important because after covering its expenses, the Fed sends most of its profits back to the U.S. Treasury, providing an additional source of revenue for the government. Under Obama, quantitative easing drove record earnings, peaking at $117 billion in 2015. During Trump's term, as the Fed scaled back its balance sheet, earnings averaged $72 billion annually. Under Biden, rising inflation led to aggressive rate hikes, which saw Federal Reserve remittances drop from $109 billion in 2021 to just $76 billion in 2022. Interestingly, as interest rates were increased in 2023 to combat high inflation, the Fed actually operated at a loss of over $100 billion. The rest of the government's revenue is a catch-all category for the smaller, less discussed sources of income. But don't let the term fool you. These revenues play a crucial role in balancing the books. One major contributor is estate and gift taxes. When wealthier individuals pass on large estates or give substantial gifts, the government collects a portion of that transfer. This tax aims to reduce wealth concentration and generate revenue for public programs. Then, there are fines and penalties from parking violations to corporate lawsuits. These may not be voluntary contributions, but they add billions to federal revenue. Natural resource royalties also fit here. When companies extract resources like oil or minerals on public land, they pay royalties, contributing to this category. In 2023, these miscellaneous sources added up to over $135 billion. While it might seem like pocket change compared to trillions in income taxes, it's enough to fund vital programs and make a big difference. With the vast majority of government revenue coming from taxes, it makes sense to take a look at how taxation in the United States compares to other wealthy countries. In 2022, the United States had a tax-to-GDP ratio of 28%. Compare that to the OECD average of 33.9%. with countries like Denmark and France exceeding 40%. Tax to GDP is the percentage of a country's total economic output, its gross domestic product, that comes from taxes. It's a key metric because it shows how much of a nation's wealth is being redirected to fund public services, infrastructure, and government programs. Countries with higher tax to GDP ratios often provide robust public services like universal health care and tuition-free education. In contrast, the US relies more on private funding, which may explain its lower ratio. But lower taxes also mean less revenue to address critical challenges like infrastructure or inequality. Where should the US strike the balance? That's the debate policymakers and citizens alike need to tackle. In 2023, the US government collected $4.439 trillion in revenue. But revenue is only half the story. How does the government choose to spend this money? In the 2023 fiscal year, the US government spent $6.134 trillion, a staggering sum that reflects the scale and complexity of managing a nation as vast and dynamic as the United States. This chart highlights how government expenses and their share of GDP have fluctuated from 1999 to 2023. During periods of economic stability, expenses as a percentage of GDP tend to hold steady. But in times of crisis, like the 2008 financial crash or the COVID-19 pandemic, spending surges. Why? Because the government steps in with stimulus packages, unemployment benefits, and other relief measures to stabilize the economy. What's interesting is the long-term trend. Expenses as a percentage of GDP haven't fully returned to pre-pandemic levels, indicating how challenges like aging populations and rising healthcare costs are reshaping the government's financial landscape. Government spending falls into two broad categories: mandatory and discretionary. Mandatory spending, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, is determined by existing laws and doesn't require annual approval. It's automatic, and it accounts for the lion's share of the federal budget. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, covers areas like defense, education, and transportation. This spending is decided through annual negotiations in Congress, making it more flexible and often more controversial. Expenses are more variable than revenues. This is because revenue, driven by taxes, is relatively stable year to year, fluctuating mostly with the health of the economy. Expenses, however, reflect policy choices and priorities. This variability shows the tug-of-war between parties and presidents over how to allocate resources. Each dollar spent represents a policy decision, a vision for how to address problems and invest in the nation's future. Let's begin with mandatory spending, where the government has little choice but to spend this money because it is bound by prior commitments and laws. Social Security stands as the largest expenditure in the U.S. federal budget. In 2023, the government allocated $1.359 trillion to this program, underscoring its pivotal role in American society. But what exactly is Social Security? Established in 1935, it's a federal program designed to provide financial support to retirees, disabled individuals, and families of deceased workers. Essentially, it's a safety net ensuring that millions can maintain a basic standard of living during challenging times. Over the years, Social Security costs have been on an upward trajectory. In 2000, expenditures were approximately $400 billion. By 2023, they had more than tripled. This surge is largely attributed to the aging baby boomer generation entering retirement, leading to a higher number of beneficiaries. When we look globally, countries tackle social protection in vastly different ways, often reflecting their unique cultural values and economic priorities. Many OECD nations dedicate a significantly larger percentage of their GDP to social welfare programs than the US, where the tax to GDP ratio and public spending on social programs are comparatively lower. For example, France allocates nearly 31% of its GDP to social protection, and Denmark is close behind, investing around 30%. These higher spending levels often translate into more comprehensive services, such as universal health care, robust unemployment benefits, and generous retirement pensions. However, more spending doesn't always guarantee better outcomes. The U.S. faces a complex challenge, balancing the financial sustainability of Social Security with the needs of a growing retiree population. As the ratio of workers to beneficiaries narrows, ensuring the program's longevity becomes increasingly critical. Ultimately, Social Security isn't just a line item in the budget. It's a reflection of our commitment to support one another across generations. Navigating its future will require thoughtful policy decisions and a shared dedication to the well-being of all Americans. In 2023, Medicare and Medicaid were among the largest expenditures in the U.S. federal budget. Medicare accounted for $1.022 trillion, making it the second largest expense, while Medicaid followed closely at $802 billion. Medicare is a federal program providing health insurance primarily to people aged 65 and older, regardless of income, as well as to some younger individuals with disabilities. In contrast, Medicaid is a joint federal and state program offering health coverage to low-income individuals and families, with eligibility and benefits varying by state. Medicare and Medicaid focus on specific populations: older adults, low-income families, and the disabled. They don't apply directly to most working-age Americans with private insurance, but play a critical role in the U.S. healthcare system by covering vulnerable groups and influencing overall healthcare costs and policies. Since 2000, spending on Medicare and Medicaid has risen sharply, driven by factors like an aging population and expanded eligibility. Under President George W. Bush, Medicare Part D was introduced, adding prescription drug coverage. The Affordable Care Act, enacted during President Obama's tenure, expanded Medicaid eligibility in many states. The Trump administration sought to modify these programs, including attempts to repeal the ACA and implement work requirements for Medicaid. Under President Biden, efforts have focused on further expanding access and reducing prescription drug costs. When comparing healthcare systems internationally, it's clear that American healthcare is more expensive than most comparable countries and suffers from significantly worse outcomes. Part of this can be attributed to Medicare and Medicaid. For example, Medicare Part D prohibits the federal government from negotiating drug prices broadly, resulting in much higher pharmaceutical costs compared to other countries where governments negotiate directly with drug manufacturers. For instance, Americans pay 2 to 3 times more for common medications like insulin. Both Medicare and Medicaid primarily operate on a fee-for-service model, where providers are reimbursed for each test, procedure, or visit. This incentivizes higher utilization of services, even when they may not improve health outcomes. Medicare and Medicaid don't provide comprehensive universal coverage. Many individuals still need supplemental plans, which increases overall system complexity and costs. The reliance on private insurers leads to higher administrative overhead. Countries with universal healthcare systems provide seamless coverage for all citizens, reducing gaps in care. Countries with lower per capita healthcare spending often achieve better outcomes, such as higher life expectancy or lower infant mortality. The U.S. spends more per person, but achieves lower health metrics, partly due to inefficiencies and inequities in Medicare and Medicaid's reach. As the U.S. population continues to age, the sustainability of Medicare and Medicaid becomes increasingly critical. Balancing cost control with the provision of quality care remains a pressing challenge, prompting discussions on how to reform these programs to better serve all Americans. In 2023, the government allocated billions to other vital social programs. Retirement benefits for federal employees and military personnel totaled $174 billion, supporting financial security for retirees. SNAP, the nation's largest food assistance program, received $127 billion, reducing food insecurity and boosting the economy. Veterans benefits, including healthcare and education, totaled $133 billion, with recent expansions enhancing access. Unemployment insurance received $62 billion, stabilizing the economy during downturns despite fraud challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit, totaling $113 billion, aimed to reduce poverty and support working families. Supplemental Security Income provided $53 billion to assist vulnerable individuals, while the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program and foster care programs received $27 billion combined to support families and children. School meal programs, home energy assistance programs, and smaller initiatives received $48 billion addressing nutrition, energy costs, and community needs. These investments highlight just some of the government's commitments to supporting Americans, though challenges remain in optimizing impact. As we've seen, mandatory spending forms the backbone of the U.S. federal budget, encompassing vital programs that touch the lives of millions. While these programs are indispensable, they also highlight the challenges of balancing rising costs with efficiency and effectiveness. Now that we've explored the commitments the government is bound to fulfill, let's shift gears and dive into discretionary spending, the part of the budget where policymakers have more flexibility to set priorities and shape the nation's future. From defense to education and infrastructure, discretionary spending reveals how the government invests in America's growth and security. Let's take a closer look. Defense spending is by far the largest discretionary expense for the U.S. government. In 2023, the United States allocated a staggering $858 billion to defense. That's more than any other discretionary category, and the third largest government expense overall, trailing only Social Security and Medicare. In the early 2000s, spending surged due to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, peaking in 2010 at over $800 billion. During the Obama administration, budgets declined as combat operations wound down, reaching $586 billion by 2015. But under the Trump administration, defense spending rose again, surpassing $700 billion, driven by investments in modernizing the military. In 2023, under President Biden, defense spending hit $858 billion, partly to address the emerging threats like cyber warfare and geopolitical tensions with Russia and China. The U.S. spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. Why does the U.S. spend so much? It's about maintaining global influence. The U.S. military presence worldwide helps secure trade routes, deter aggression, and reinforce alliances. But this raises important questions. Could some of this funding be redirected towards domestic priorities like healthcare, education, or infrastructure? Defense spending shapes not just national security, but also America's role in the world. As we continue exploring discretionary spending, we'll see how other priorities compete for resources in the federal budget. Health and Human Services, excluding Medicaid, is the second largest discretionary expense in the U.S. federal budget. In 2023, the government spent $125 billion to fund programs designed to protect the health and well-being of Americans. So what does this spending cover? A large portion funds the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, which received over $47 billion in 2023 to drive groundbreaking medical research on diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's, and COVID-19. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention also plays a crucial role, with $11 billion allocated for public health initiatives, such as disease prevention and emergency preparedness. Meanwhile, programs like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration received $10 billion to combat the opioid epidemic and expand mental health services across the country. This category also includes funding for critical public health efforts like maternal and child health programs, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, and grants to support rural health clinics. The U.S. leads the world in medical innovation, but millions of Americans still face barriers to basic care. How the U.S. allocates funds between cutting-edge research and accessible healthcare could define the health outcomes of future generations. The question is, are they striking the right balance? Education programs are the third largest discretionary expense in the budget. In 2023, the government spent $120 billion on education, a crucial investment in the nation's future. Education spending funded a variety of programs designed to support students and schools across the nation. For example, Title I grants received $18 billion to help schools in low-income areas improve the quality of education and give every child a fair shot at success. Around $16 billion was allocated to support students with disabilities through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, ensuring they receive the specialized resources and services they need to thrive. Pell Grants, a cornerstone of college affordability, provided nearly $27 billion in financial aid to more than 6 million low-income students, helping to make higher education more accessible. Beyond these, funding also supported career and technical education programs, initiative in STEM training, and improvements to school infrastructure, all essential investments to prepare students for the demands of a rapidly changing world. Education spending has fluctuated significantly over the past 2 decades. During the early 2000s, funding increased under President George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind Act, which emphasized standardized testing and accountability. Under President Obama, spending surged with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act during the 2008 financial crisis, pumping billions into education to stabilize schools and prevent teacher layoffs. President Biden's 2023 budget increased Pell Grants and funding for underfunded schools, but many argue it still falls short of what's needed to compete globally. Transportation is the fourth largest discretionary expense in the budget. In 2023, the government spent $106 billion to keep the nation moving, literally. Transportation spending covers a wide range of critical infrastructure and services. A significant portion of this investment went to highway construction and maintenance, ensuring the 4 million miles of U.S. roads remain drivable. Billions were also directed to modernize public transit systems, improve railway networks, and expand airport capacity to handle growing passenger and cargo demands. Notably, the bipartisan infrastructure law provided funding for transformative projects, such as repairing aging bridges and supporting green initiatives like electric vehicle charging stations. Transportation is more than getting from point A to point B. It's about connecting people, powering economies, and shaping the future. How we choose to invest today will define how we move tomorrow. In 2023, the U.S. government allocated $78 billion to housing and urban development, aiming to ensure safe and affordable housing for all Americans. These funds support a variety of programs. For example, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, commonly known as Section 8, assists low-income families in affording private rental housing. The Public Housing Operating Fund helps manage and maintain public housing properties. Housing affordability has become a significant challenge. According to the OECD, housing costs have risen faster than incomes in many countries, including the U.S., leading to increased financial strain on households. Furthermore, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition reports that in 2023, there was a shortage of over 7 million affordable and available rental homes for extremely low-income renters. This gap contributes to homelessness, with the Department of Housing and Urban Development estimating that on a single night, approximately 580,000 people experienced homelessness in the U.S. While the U.S. allocates a significant budget to housing, it spends a smaller percentage of its GDP on housing and community amenities compared to other OECD countries. This raises a critical question. Are current investments sufficient to tackle the growing challenges of housing affordability and homelessness? As housing costs continue to outpace incomes, and with a significant portion of the population facing housing insecurity, it's imperative to assess and potentially rethink our housing policies and funding priorities to ensure all Americans have access to safe and affordable housing. In 2023, the U.S. government spent $70 billion on science and technology, funding research and innovation that drive progress and keep America competitive in a rapidly changing world. This funding supports a range of critical programs. For example, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, received $25 billion to explore space and advance satellite technologies. The National Science Foundation, or NSF, with a $10 billion budget, funded groundbreaking research in fields like artificial intelligence and climate science. The Department of Energy invested billions into clean energy initiatives, including advancing battery technology and developing nuclear fusion as a potential energy source. While the U.S. leads the world in total spending on research and development, as a percentage of GDP, countries like South Korea and Israel invest significantly more. Science and technology funding shapes the future, from groundbreaking medical advancements to tackling existential challenges like climate change. The big question is America investing enough and focused on the right priorities to ensure the U.S. remains a leader in innovation while addressing the needs of future generations? In 2023, the U.S. government spent $60 billion on energy and environmental protection, funding efforts to combat climate change, ensure clean air and water, and promote sustainable energy sources. This spending supports initiatives like renewable energy development, nuclear safety, and environmental cleanup. The Department of Energy invests in technologies like wind, solar, and battery storage, while the Environmental Protection Agency works to safeguard natural resources and public health. Under the Trump administration, there were sharp proposed cuts to the EPA.
The wind, it sounds so wonderful. The wind is bullshit. I'll tell you,
Though Congress often maintained funding. Recently, the Biden administration boosted investments in renewable energy and electric vehicle infrastructure through legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act. How America funds energy and environmental protection shapes not only the health of our planet, but also the legacy we leave for future generations. Beyond the major categories, several smaller discretionary expenses add up to billions. For example, the U.S. allocated $59 billion to international affairs in 2023, supporting diplomacy, foreign aid, and global development. Justice and law enforcement received $55 billion, funding agencies like the FBI and DEA, with increases in cybersecurity and drug trafficking efforts. Agriculture programs, excluding food aid, received $50 billion, primarily for subsidies and crop insurance. Spending reflects trade wars and climate-related losses, with a focus on large-scale farming over smallholder agriculture. Treasury programs like tax collection and debt management cost $35 billion. Government administration and operations, funded at $30 billion, includes federal buildings and IT systems. FEMA received $18 billion to address disasters like wildfires and hurricanes, with rising costs due to extreme weather. Small business administration programs were funded at $15 billion, reflecting a focus on entrepreneurship, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Spending far exceeds many OECD countries. Native American programs received $12 billion for healthcare, education, and housing, though funding remains below similar efforts in Canada and Australia. Regulatory agencies cost $8 billion, overseeing markets, consumer protection, and technology. Legal aid and public advocacy received $7 billion, ensuring access to justice for low-income Americans. Arts and cultural programs received $6 billion, funding institutions like the Smithsonian. The SEC was allocated $2 billion for financial market oversight, addressing rising complexities like cryptocurrencies. Smaller discretionary expenses, from disaster relief to land management, add up to billions, supporting critical government functions and infrastructure. Discretionary spending is where the government has the most flexibility, and these expenses reflect choices made by each administration to shape America's future. From defense to education, housing, and even smaller programs, every dollar tells a story about what the U.S. prioritizes as a nation. Other countries often make different choices, spending more on social welfare, healthcare, or infrastructure, while spending less on defense or administrative costs. These differences remind us that budgets aren't just about numbers, they're about values and priorities. Americans have the power to shape these choices. If you believe something should change, you have a voice. Let's use it to ensure the budget reflects the kind of country you want it to be. Now that we've explored how the government spends its money, let's turn to a crucial question. How does it pay for all of this? If you were paying attention, you might have noticed that, in 2023, the government generated $4.4 trillion in revenue, but spent just over $6 trillion. That's right, the U.S. ran a staggering deficit of $1.695 trillion, spending far more than it brought in. But what does that mean for the country's finances, and how does it affect you? Let's break it down. Since the year 2000, the U.S. federal government has gone from running a $236 billion surplus to consistently running deficits, including a record $3.1 trillion deficit in 2020. What happened? Deficits became the norm due to a mix of circumstances. Economic downturns like the 2008 recession, costly wars, tax cuts, and growing spending on programs like Social Security, Medicare, and defense. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic pushed deficits into overdrive as the government spent trillions on stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, and healthcare. So how does the U.S. cover a $1.695 trillion deficit? It borrows the money. The Treasury issues government bonds, Treasury bills, and notes, essentially IOUs that investors buy, including individuals, banks, and even foreign governments like China and Japan. These investors earn interest over time. Currently, the U.S. owes over $33 trillion in national debt. This borrowing helps fund everything from defense to Social Security, but it also means paying billions of dollars annually in interest. Should citizens be concerned? It depends. In the short term, deficits can be a tool for economic stability, but long term, growing debt raises risks, higher interest costs, reduced fiscal flexibility, and potential impacts on future generations. Ultimately, the deficit reflects choices about priorities and policies. If you are concerned about rising debt, It's a reminder that citizen voices matter in shaping fiscal policy for a more balanced future. Every dollar the government spends, and every dollar it borrows, is a choice. Choices about priorities, values, and the kind of future we want to build. These decisions shape the U.S. economy, American communities, and America's role in the world. But here's the thing. We don't have to accept the status quo. As a citizen, you have the power to ask tough questions, demand transparency, and advocate for change. America has got so many things right. Innovations, freedoms, and opportunities unmatched anywhere else. But there's always room to improve. America can build on its successes and tackle its challenges with creativity and courage. In future videos, we'll take a deeper dive into these topics, exploring bold alternatives and innovative ideas to tackle the challenges America faces. The path forward isn't set in stone. It's up to us to shape it. So what kind of future do you want to create? Let's start that conversation together.